And which quarterbacks should folks be starting this week?
Well, let's start with Lamar Jackson because I know we're getting a lot of questions about him, and I have him as a start this week going up against the Indianapolis Colts, who have been one of the tougher teams against quarterbacks this season. Lamar Jackson himself has scuffled a little bit. He's currently the quarterback 10, averaging just right around 20 fantasy points per game. But what we need to look at are the recent trends. The Colts have allowed a top 4 quarterback finish last week. Matthew Stafford got him for 336 and 3 touchdowns. They've allowed a top 13 quarterback in 2 consecutive games. Joe Burrow threw a lot of yards against them, but didn't get into the end zone. But I think because of the floor with Lamar Jackson running, he's a safe start. And I'm also going to go back to Cam Newton. He had 18 fantasy points on Sunday. He lost 2 on that fumble, which was unfortunate, but he's had at least 18 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games. He's still a great threat to run the football himself. The Jets have allowed 9 rushing touchdowns this season. They've allowed the 4th most yards per game passing this season. So this is a good matchup. Cam didn't play horrible last week. I know he had that unfortunate fumble again, but he played well, and I would feel confident starting him.
All right, so we hopefully a couple of scuffling quarterbacks are back in our good graces. At the running back spot, who has your eye this week?
Well, I'm going to go back to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who for the first time this season did not get at least 11 fantasy points. And that's okay, because that Jets game was kind of weird. It was kind of like Patrick Mahomes wanted to flex a little bit. He wanted to throw the football. When Patrick Mahomes decides he's going to throw 5 touchdowns, he's just throwing 5 touchdowns. But now you've got a great matchup against the Carolina Panthers, who've allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs. The only reason that streak got broken is because David Montgomery didn't take advantage of it. And they've allowed the 4th most scrimmage yards to running backs this season. And another running back that I really like this week is James Robinson going up against the Houston Texans. Again, we talked about Jake Luton earlier in the show. I don't think he's going to be a detriment, especially not against this Texans team. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, just behind the Carolina Panthers. They've allowed the most rushing yards per game this season, 151 on average. And you know what? James Robinson averages over 100 scrimmage yards per game. So I feel you should feel very comfortable with this matchup.
Yeah, I see no drop off for James Robinson just because they made the change at quarterback. I think he's still going to be fine. I think you can still be confident. Okay, wide receiver, who should be in people's lineups this week?
Well, I'm going to go back to Tyler Lockett, even though it's very frustrating because if you've noticed the trend over the last couple of weeks, it's like DK, Tyler, DK, and now it stands to reason it would just be Tyler. I know it's not that simple. You don't hand out production like I handle movie night. You know, my 2 kids, every Friday they get to pick a movie, and it's 1 week or the other. You get it 1 week, Ahsoka gets it 1 week, Wedge gets it the other, and then they pick it. Finally, they both love Into the Spider-Verse, so they can, come together on that one. But I think Lockett is just too good to leave on your bench. And I know it's going to be unfortunate sometimes that he's not going to perform as the way that you want him to, but you got to start him. And I'll stay in that game. I'm going to go with Stephon Diggs, who is currently the wide receiver 12 this season. He's really struggled over the last couple of weeks in the same way that Josh Allen has struggled since the first month of the season. But you know what? The Seahawks have allowed the most points per games to wide receivers. They've allowed the most receiving yards per game. And you know what? Stephon Diggs gets all the targets. He gets close to 30% of the targets, which puts him right around 5th in the NFL amongst the position.
I really love the Diggs pick this week, and it's interesting you pick 2 guys on different sides of that same game. But I'm also with you. I think NFL bylaws say that both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett cannot simultaneously have good games. So this is probably the Tyler Lockett week, so that's fine. Tight end has been the bane of everyone's existence for most of the year. So please help us with a couple of tight end starts for week 9.
Well, Rob Gronkowski, who is my favorite WWE 24/7 champion of all time. And apparently he was a good football player before that, but whatever. He's had a touchdown in 3 consecutive weeks now. And now it looks like he's fully returned. He is a guy that we can trust. And especially at a position where we're without George Kittle, Travis Kelce is really the only guy who is consistently putting up points, except Rob Gronkowski has been doing that over the last couple of weeks. And he's really shown that connection. Listen, he was retired. He was, not didn't have a training camp or anything like that. He's now finally started to get it going. Rob Gronkowski is an automatic start every week, as is Darren Waller. And if I'm not mistaken, if I'm thinking about this correctly, I would say Darren Waller is the second best tight end in fantasy football. And last week, he broke a streak of, I think it was like he was having a streak of like 15 points a game, where he was doing really well. Didn't score that well against Cleveland, but he was the most targeted pass catcher in that game, which is what's the most important. Sometimes the point production's not going to be there, but as long as he's being targeted, you have nothing to worry about. This is a good enough matchup against the Chargers in the Battle of LA, and I know exactly what I just said. I start Darren Waller without any hesitation.
So where do the Rams factor into the Battle of LA? Are they just are they the champions awaiting the two challengers here, or what?
It's a triple threat. You know what? And as somebody, listen, you've lived here long enough. You know, like the Raiders are a very popular team here. Like there's no getting around it. And there are certain neighborhoods where they're the number one team. And Vegas is sort of a suburb of Los Angeles anyways. So it kind of fits.
No, I think all that is 100% true. I have no beef with any of that. All right, defense. A couple of defenses for folks to start this week.
Well, I didn't realize how chalky I was when I turned this in. I turned this in late on Monday night, and sometimes I'm not thinking. Obviously, the Steelers against the Cowboys, you're going to play them. You don't have to think about that. You drafted the Steelers, you're playing them. The Chiefs are also very good. I think the Chiefs kind of fly under the radar a little bit. I do want to say one thing. You don't run B-roll or anything, because this is a very important point, but I want everybody to know. Washington is obviously a good start this week. Everybody picked them up off the waiver wire. Washington was on a bye. You could have picked them up Sunday night, and then you're probably sitting there looking at me like, thanks, Rank. I could have used that information yesterday. I understand. The Eagles are on a bye this week. They play the Giants next week. Sunday night, if you have a guy on your roster who you don't need anymore, drop them, pick up the Eagles. You don't have to burn a waiver claim, but pick up the Eagles. If somebody did not have the foresight to hold them through the bye week, go pick up the Eagles Sunday, Monday, and then you know what? You got your defense all ready for next week. So I'm sorry that I'm letting you down by telling you to start the Steelers, which you were already going to do, but I gave you a solid tip for the following week.
In your defense, though, when you wrote that, you certainly didn't know about the Andy Dalton situation. You didn't know Cooper Rush was going to start. So, I think you can be given a pass on this one. I think that's fine. So, all right, that was Secure Starts presented by Visa. And after we talk about the good starts, we should talk about the not so good starts, which I think actually basically means the sits. So after that whole long run around, quarterbacks for folks to avoid this week. Who do you got?
Well, it's hard because these quarterbacks, even the guys that are like the QB 19 or whatever, they're still being productive. So I'm going to say Drew Brees, who I'm going to sit this week. He's currently the quarterback 13, which in 12-team leagues, that would make him a QB 2. He had 14 fantasy points, just over it in week 1 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That defense is really good. They've allowed just over 14 fantasy points per game this season. They've allowed the 7th fewest passing touchdowns per game this season. And I think the Buccaneers defense is so overlooked because everything that's going on with the Bucs, with Tom Brady, Antonio Brown, Rob Gronkowski, you forget how good that Bucs defense is. And I don't like Ryan Tannehill as much this week. Now, currently, he's the quarterback 8, but he's had fewer than 240 passing yards in back-to-back games. The Bears have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. I think part of that got skewed because Taysom Hill scored a touchdown, and I think because he's a quarterback that factors in. I don't know, but they've allowed the fewest. I don't know how that works. I want to ask Michael F. Florio about that.
That's exactly what happened.
Right? It's got to be. And the Bears have allowed the 5th fewest or the fewest passing touchdowns per game this season. The one thing that I want to point out, one of the reasons why I'm saying Ryan Tannehill, the Bears are vulnerable against the run. I think this is a Derrick Henry game. I think that's my biggest thing. This isn't so much like Ryan Tannehill is kind of proven himself as like, you can start him every week. I'm just saying that I expect this to be a heavy run script with Derrick Henry.
To your point, Taysom Hill was the QB 19 last week because he had 30 rushing yards, 35 receiving yards, and he caught a touchdown. So, that ended up going into the quarterback.
Yeah.
So
ridiculous.
So you're not wrong about that. Running backs to avoid. Who should we look out for?
Well, I'm going to take the coward's way out. Like, it's what running back do you bench? Like, I'm going to say J.D. McKissick. But even then, I know that there's somebody listening or watching or whatever, however you're absorbing this content, being like, I need to start JD McKissic. And he's not a bad player. But you know what? He's the RB43. He's had fewer than 10 fantasy points in 5 of 7 games this season, fewer than 15 fantasy points in every game this year. He's currently out-snapping Antonio Gibson. He's not out-producing him. And the Giants give up a lot of production to running backs as receivers out of the backfield, but I think that's going to skew towards Antonio Gibson this week. And I'm also going to advise to go against Jordan Wilkins, who busted out last week on the waiver wire on the bench. Nobody started him. Nobody got those points. Now he's going up against the Baltimore Ravens. The Baltimore Ravens have some injury concerns and things like that, but still, they've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to running backs this year, the 6th fewest rushing yards per game. I know that, they've given up some production to running backs here or there, but I think that the matchup, I still think that Jonathan Taylor's going to be in the mix. It was a hot hand issue. I don't like the Colts running back situation at all, so I'm going to avoid them this week, even if you have Jonathan Taylor or Nyheim Hines, whoever you might be starting.
Wilkins seems like a severe case of chasing the points. And I had someone who I presume was sort of trolling me in my mention saying, well, why'd you put Wilkins at the bottom of your waiver wire column this week? You didn't have him last week. You totally dropped the ball. And I'm like, yeah, bro. 2 weeks ago, Wilkins had 1 yard. Then the week after that, he had -1 yard. So that's a combined 0 points for 2 weeks. So this just feels like going after something that's probably not going to be there for you. Okay, so wide receivers, you had Ryan Tannehill as a sit. I would imagine that means his wide receivers probably people to avoid as well.
Yeah, I feel confident, whatever. AJ Brown is fine. Corey Davis is somebody I'm probably going to avoid this week. He's having his Devontae Parker breakout this season, which, by the way, I know you're on the NFL Fantasy Spectacular. Eric Young, the Impact champion, was on that show with us as well. And in our segment, it was great. I felt like Andy Cohen because it was like such an eclectic mix with Eric Young, Michael F. Florio, and Johnny Bananas. Like, it was so fun. Eric made a great point about Corey Davis having an opportunity to break out, and we love seeing it. He's currently the wide receiver 16, but he's had fewer than 40 receiving yards in 2 of his last 4 games. The Bears, again, are really good against running backs. They've allowed the fewest receiving touchdowns to wide receivers this season with just 2, because last week, their 2 receiving touchdowns they gave up were to a tight end and a quarterback. And as a start, I know you're probably going to run the CeeDee Lamb B-roll. Again, I do this on Monday night, taking the coward's way out, thinking that Andy Dalton could have returned. But now we're going to avoid all the Cowboys. I just want to say this is the Cowboys receivers. You could show a mixtape of this. I don't want any of these receivers. And again, I don't want to say anything bad about Cooper Rush or Ben DiNucci. These young quarterbacks can come into this league and perform well. I don't like the offensive line. I don't like going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I'm going to sit all of my Cowboys receivers, if possible. I mean, if you're sitting there and you're like, well, is it Cooper or Quintez Cephas? Okay, we might have a conversation. You might want to go with Cooper. Although I kind of like Cephas. I think that's kind of fun. But I understand. In most normal circumstances, although there are a lot of good receivers out. That's the one thing. Like, there's a lot of good receivers out this week. You got both Rams guys out. You got Tyler Boyd we talked about. T. Higgins. I think there's somebody else that I'm missing too. There's two other
the Browns are off. The Browns are off, so Jarvis Landry's
no
available.
Jarvis Landry. You know what? Like, it's a bad week. Like, this is kind of tough. So, there's going to be some streamable receivers. I should tweet out the thing I did on Fantasy Live on Tuesday to help people out.
All right. Tight end has been such a mess for us this week. So which tight ends are inevitably going to break our hearts in week 9?
Well, don't chase the fantasy points with Trey Burton, although it's fun to talk about how he has 2 rushing touchdowns this season. That's as many as Clyde Edwards-Helaire. That's more rushing touchdowns than David Montgomery, more rushing touchdowns than Devin Singletary. It's as many rushing touchdowns as Lamar Jackson, too. So it's funny. Like, I don't know what Frank Reich's trying to prove. Does he really hate Matt Nagy or something? Like, he's like, I'm going to keep feeding. Like, they're feeding Trey Burton at the goal line. I just don't want to chase that in fantasy. And another tight end that I like, but has never really stepped up, is Logan Thomas. This, again, we go back to the discussion we were having about Evan Ingram, about like how I'll wait it out with Evan Ingram, knowing that I'm going to get between 10 to 12 points. Because Logan Thomas is so volatile. Like, I want to like him, but I can't trust him, so I'm not going to start him. So he's on the bench this week.
I feel like Logan Thomas basically is just getting his steps in on Wednesday because he's out on the field a lot. He's running a lot of routes, and I guess he's getting a decent number of targets, but the production hasn't been there. So I'm not really sure what he's accomplishing other than getting cardio in for the Washington football team every single week. All right, finally, defenses to avoid. Who should people be aware of?
I don't know. Like the teams that are going up against good squads. Like, I don't know. Like, I wish I didn't have to. This is so difficult. Like, you know who you start and who you don't start. So you got to pick teams at random. Like, although I will say the Chargers to me, like that's a team that I feel like people pick up, and they might have picked them up last week going up against Drew Lock in Denver, and we're like, okay, cool. I think that this Raiders team can move the ball enough to where I don't want to play the Chargers this week. If I can find some other streaming option, if I can pick up the Washington FT or find somebody else like that, then I feel a little bit better about that. So I think the Chargers, not quite what we thought they were going to be at the beginning of the season. So I don't necessarily believe in them. Of course, as always, check the NFL.com fantasy rankings before you make any final decision. And again, I put the Cowboys on there because I'm a coward and they make me pick somebody. Like, I don't know, Cowboys. Like, I don't want to start them. Listen, use the NFL.com fantasy rankings. They're very, like, you know, the teams that you don't want to play the Giants. Like, actually, I will tell you this. I know we're talking about sits right now. The Giants are not a bad streamable option this week. I think that and I know I'm ruining the B-roll and everything, and the producers are going to get mad at me and be like, can you give us a heads up next time? Like, no, because this is stream of consciousness. And I just thought about the Giants. We're streaming the Washington FT. You can actually stream the Giants on the other side if you miss out on that, because it's like Kyle Allen is not, it's not some great quarterback.